Hello comrades, Adam here. It's been a tricky few weeks here at Bread and Rosaries HQ, and this episode is a week late. We're sorry about that. There wasn't a whole lot we could do about it, and of course it does mean that some of the stuff we talk about is a little bit out of date. We left it in anyway because we think some of it's interesting and funny, hopefully, and so we hope that you enjoy this episode nonetheless.
Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the only UK-based leftist Christian podcast brave enough to just have two men talking. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington and I am joined by Adam Spears. Adam, isn't it nice to have a space for men's opinions for once?
I feel heard, finally.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world where, men's opinions are just no longer accepted, but it's time that our voices are heard again.
Yeah. Do you know what? We've just before we started recording, we've been talking about some Twitter guy who also has a podcast and is a C of E priest. And one of the hashtags he's got two hashtags in his bio, and one of the hashtags is just hashtag Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
that's just what came into my head when you said that.
Yeah. What we're doing, ironically, that podcast probably does entirely unironically. Yeah, it's a bit of a boys' club today. Lou is not available, so it is just me and Adam. But we're going to crack on anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about evangelism, other religions, that sort of stuff, based on one of those lovely Anglican storm in a teacups you get on Twitter on a roughly weekly timetable.
Ben, are we an Anglican podcast? Because we seem to talk about it all the time, and I guess on one level that's because all three of us have some affiliation, greater or lesser extents.
Yeah, thank you for including me in that carefully. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but you're just an Anglican in denial. That's the thing. Lou and I, we are very much Anglicans. I think we are in denial on some level as well. But
sure, yeah, everyone is. Yeah, I think yes. That's a fair question. The answer is no. We're not an Anglican podcast, but as you've established, all three of us have some sort of affiliation. But also, because of both of its role and its size, the Church of England is the thing that actually gets the most press and noise and interest.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, we probably should. I am always aware that we're very Anglican focused, but we do try and get our ecumenical friends on here and there, even an atheist now and again. In fact, we're going something completely different because we're going to start by talking about some Catholics.
Wow, that's a bit far. That's a bit far for me.
Yeah, some people would say we're not even doing Christianity anymore. Not me, to be clear.
Those people are wrong. But
yeah. Well, let us start with new podcast, Same Old Nonsense, a segment to which we will create a jingle at some point, I think. This is our little news section, and I've got a news here from the Scottish Daily Express, which
it's a reputable.
Yeah. It's not about Princess Diana. I don't know if that's just a British Daily Express or an English Daily Express thing, I should say. Sorry.
Yeah, careful now.
Yeah. Catholic Church appoints sectarian shame schoolteacher to Peace and Justice post.
I love that headline because it just there is no hiding what position it's coming from.
This woman has been hired to a post by the Catholic Church, the Social Teaching Engagement Officer for the National Peace and Justice Commission, by the Bishops' Conference of Scotland. So it's a Catholic Church post, but it turns out that she's actually been convicted previously for sending grossly offensive messages online. Dun dun dun.
I mean, I know people have also been convicted of that kind of thing, and the stuff they sent I was like, you got convicted for that?
Yeah. She got convicted in 2016 for essentially posting pro-IRA slogans on the internet, and she got banned for being a teacher as a result. She apparently, so this was in 2015. These comments were made. She called herself Provo Princess.
Wow.
And there's a really great bit where it starts kind of explaining things she said, and then the article pauses to have a big black and white photo of a member of the IRA with the caption, "The IRA killed an estimated 1,700 people during the Troubles." Just to remind you, like, you might think this woman is cool, but this is actually really bad. She posted a picture of a masked man carrying a rifle with the caption, "When you're having a Republican kind of day." She called the Dutch football side Ajax orange bastards. I cannot believe that you can get that's just a funny thing. Like, I can absolutely imagine calling a football team orange bastards. How is that controversial? And she said that she was in Ronnie's Fenian band, which is a reference to former Celtic boss Ronnie Delia.
She also said on that first one you talked about, she said the caption you gave was actually in the photo. The caption she gave was, "Every day is a Ra day." Ra being the IRA, right?
Yeah,
What Ra means. And, I mean, probably some of these comments were ill-advised, but I think it's probably a bit much to say that you should be convicted of anything for this.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the thing is, the state of the public debate around, especially sort of outside of Ireland, actually, around the IRA, around Irish republicanism, around that kind of thing, is just really quite staggeringly ill-informed. And, you know, you can argue this woman, yeah, okay, obvious lack of nuance there, fine. But one rather wonders whether someone praising the parachute regiment would also be convicted of this kind of thing. Because they also killed a lot of people in occupied Ireland, and they still operate as an arm of the state.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone wants to return to the days of the Troubles, right? Like, I mean, I certainly don't. I'm sure you don't either.
Yeah.
You know, that is not something we want to see. We don't want to see armed people conducting this kind of thing on the streets. But it's important to recognise that liberation movements, resistance movements against colonial powers, they're complicated, right? You know, there's some bad shit that happens, right? Nobody's saying there isn't, but they're complicated. And to frame this as, well, aren't the IRA awful and this person is terrible for backing the IRA, well, that's a double standard for me.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting to compare that to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You know, most people are, I think, opposed to that Russian invasion, correctly. But there's plenty of people who seem pretty willing to brush over the presence of actual Nazis in the Ukrainian army in order to defend it. And that's not to say, well, we should be opposing the Ukrainians defending themselves, but simply to say that it's interesting how some complicated resistance efforts are allowed to be complicated and morally grey, and others, like the IRA, are just the baddies.
Because who controls the narrative, right? Like, that's what this boils down to. You know, the narrative is controlled by people with power. And the IRA, whether we like them, don't like them, whether we have a more nuanced view of them, Sinn Féin even. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that Gerry Adams couldn't even appear on TV or radio without his voice or his image being censored. And so, you know, that should be evidence of who is controlling the narrative here and why we can't have nuanced and interesting conversations about this stuff that actually seeks a proper solution.
I think it's also an interesting reminder that as English people, I think we can sometimes be quite ignorant. I know I certainly can, of the level of sectarianism that exists in Ireland and obviously in Scotland.
And Scotland,
yeah. You know, which is interesting because this is a question about Irish nationalism that actually is rearing its head in Scotland in some, you know, quite notable ways. And, you know, anyone knows the history of the Old Firm derby between Rangers and Celtic will know that is a long history about Irish independence, really. A lot of that comes down to, as well as, you know, Catholics and Protestants. And it is interesting that this obviously involves the Catholic Church, because that is, again, an angle that we seem to increasingly forget, that the extent to which this was a religious conflict.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognise the the fact that Glasgow in particular has seen a lot of immigration and emigration to and from Ireland, especially the occupied north. And so that's how you've ended up actually with Scots being a language in Northern Ireland. Ulster Scots is a recognised language in Northern Ireland. Oh, I just called it Northern Ireland. The state's getting to me, Ben.
Occupied Ireland.
The occupied 6 counties. Yeah.
So if you're wondering, anyone listening, what our view on the Irish question is, that might have explained it in some depth.
Yeah. I'm just saying, though, it's important to recognise that level of emigration between Scotland and occupied Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps we will touch again on some of those issues in Ireland and Scotland, but possibly with someone who knows what they're talking about would be a good idea, I think. Let's move on to some people who really, really don't know what they're talking about. The Church of England Evangelical Council. They had a tweet. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. These people are kind of not worth taking seriously to some extent. But they tweeted a photo, and the photo says, "A question for the House of Bishops on proposed prayers /LLF, as in living in love and faith." So this is the tiny baby, pathetically small steps being made by the Church of England to move towards some sort of inclusion for queer people. And they say, what happens for a local minister who is asked to conduct a same-sex marriage when they say no and the local media find out? The effects of a conscience clause will be unequal. So they're basically living in fear of being cancelled for what they have to say. And a lot of people have responded to this. There's kind of 2 main responses to it. One is, well, that's not really going to happen. What's the consequences that you get some nasty headlines or, whatever? You're not really that under threat. Stop trying to get yourselves to be oppressed when you're not. And the second is to say, well, you guys want an opportunity to present the gospel? Here you go. Here's your stage. Aren't you meant to always have an answer ready for people who ask about this stuff? Which, I mean, they're not unfair responses. But I do think there's something quite interesting to compare it to the last thing we had, where actually there are people who are, that woman lost her job due to some ill-advised, but ultimately reasonably harmless comments online. And she's now being dragged through the press again when she's got a new job for those comments. Whereas at the same time, these guys are scared that the press might take wind of them actually having an opinion and publicise that opinion and being scared of how that might happen.
Yeah, and I mean, the comments beneath this are actually quite interesting, because one of the guys that we mentioned before with his bio having Jordan Peterson in it has responded to someone else who actually draws a lot of this stuff out and says, what happens when people refuse to receive ministry from an ordained woman? Sort of making the point that people who choose not to... And let's be clear, this is a choice, right? It is a choice not to receive ministry from an ordained woman or to, refuse to conduct equal marriages and so on. This is a choice you've made. The information about why this is not a loving reflection of the gospel is out there. It's not hard to find. But the response to that, I think, is pretty interesting, because this particular vicar goes on to talk about hard left identitarian activists and using nasty battle tactics on local clergy, weaponizing the local press and so on. And I think what he's actually saying here is that he doesn't want pushback against people who are stating overtly hateful things, right?
Yeah.
And look, on some level, we have to have that kind of compromise, right? We're not going to convince people overnight with this stuff. It's a long, drawn-out thing, and clearly these people are on the losing side. That much is clear already. But I can see why people want to include some kind of conscience clause. I think I prefer the way, we spoke about it before, I prefer the way they did it in, was it Sweden or Norway, where actually they said, this is the way the church is going. We're not going to ordain you if you think otherwise, but we're also not going to get rid of you if you've already been ordained and think otherwise. I think that's a better way to do it, because then you can go as a church. But this kind of typical Anglican fudge that we seem to end up with for everything, I just don't think it does anyone any favours, to be honest.
Yeah. I also think, I can reflect on this from a slightly different perspective, because when I was involved in small town local politics, I did experience some what it meant to have some local press attention and particularly some social media attention. And it wasn't fun, you know?
I don't think you've ever told me about this, Ben. I knew you were on the
yeah.
council, but I don't know what
God.
happened
Yeah.
as a result of that.
Well, the council in name after I left it did go viral. So maybe we'll talk about that another time. It's a whole story. But it was quite an unpleasant experience. So I don't know. I think actually I don't want to dismiss the fact that things can be quite unpleasant when particularly social media and people are built up into viewing you in a certain way and all this sort of stuff. And I didn't really get the brunt of it, but I was kind of related to some of it. I guess where I would differ from a lot of people is that I think that's something that homophobes should experience. Like, I didn't like experiencing it, but I feel personally like my experiences of it were unjust, but the experience of it, if you have actually done something appalling, like been a homophobe, is probably a just outcome of your choices, you know? So, like, yeah, it's horrible to have those things happen, but, like, do you know what? You could avoid them by not being an asshole.
Well, I also think it's important to recognise that often what a lot of these people are classifying as pile-ons and bullying and all that kind of thing is just people saying, hey, you shouldn't be homophobic. And not always, but a lot of the time, they're including people in this who are trying to do the work with them, who are actually saying, hey, look, I know why you feel this way. Let's try and talk about why this will be a problem. And they just, like, a lot of the time, these people who try and do that sort of thing are just blocked, you know? But this is the kind of thing that they're talking about as well. And so they're not engaging, they're clearly, obviously not engaging with people who are understandably angry about what they're saying and doing. But they're also, a lot of the time, not engaging with people who are trying to be understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's all about trying to set themselves up as martyrs and oppress people, when actually people disliking the actual views you hold and expressing their dislike, it's not really oppression. Like,
and honestly, I mean, I've also had a lot of backlash online because I've done some media appearances in the past, and, you know, I've had death threats from that. You know, it's not fun, but, like, frankly, I was fine.
Yeah, there's a distinction, isn't there, between actual physical harm and people being unpleasant. And I don't want to dismiss the impact of mental health. You know, people find that really difficult.
And it does depend why, right? If people are piling on and bullying you online for something that is just an inherent characteristic of who you are, that's a very different thing to a pile on because you're doing or saying something that's really quite nasty. For me, a lot of that came from having left-wing or anti-militarist, anti-colonialist political opinions.
You hate the troops, yeah, I get you.
Yeah. No, I don't hate the troops. I just want to bring them home.
Bring our boys home.
Yeah, bring our boys home. Yeah.
Let's move on to talk about what else is on our mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
Adam, you mentioned that you have had some media appearances in the past, including on everyone's favourite morning show, This Morning, which has been in the news recently. Do you want to briefly tell us about your experiences on This Morning?
Oh, Lord. Do you know what? Watching it back, it's kind of cringy because they got me on. Basically, they got me on because I ran a campaign when I was at university to have the white poppy sold in like university shops, and they wanted to talk about why more and more young people were, you know, not wearing the red poppy, right? So it wasn't actually about the white poppy, but I went on and I was wearing the white poppy, and they ended up sort of talking about that a lot, and that wasn't what I was there to talk about. But they also had another guy on there who was, he was an author and a former RAF pilot who he'd been shot down at one point. I mean, he was nice enough to me personally, but he and I had very different takes. Let's put it that way. So I went on This Morning to talk about this with Holly and Philip. long before the rift. And basically, I was trying to be kind of nuanced and interesting and but I just kept getting interrupted by this guy. And then Holly, the way they set it up is Philip was on my side. They'd actually got an article from my blog where I'd written about this kind of thing, and they were sort of using that as a sort of jumping off point. But then, so the way they set it up is Philip was on my side and clearly had some stuff from my blog in front of him. And then Holly was sort of on the other guy's side. And at one point, she made this point, and she was very lovely. She was nice to me, I've got no problem, but that's the way they set it up. And at one point, she said, yeah, but, I've got a son who wants to be a firefighter and wears a firefighter t-shirt and everything. And why should he be, why should you have a go at him for wanting to be a firefighter? And I'm like, it was, with all due respect to Holly Willoughby, that was one of the stupidest things you could have said in that. But when someone says something so stupid that you have no reply, right? And you're just, I'm just like, what? So watching it back, I just look really rubbish to me. They're really incompetent because she said that I'm having a go at a kid for wanting to be a firefighter or something. And I'm like, it's not about the bloody kids, right? I'm not having a go at kids wanting to be soldiers, right?
Adam, why do you hate children, Adam? Why do you hate children?
I hate the children and the troops, especially children that want to be troops. But that's it's a crazy thing. It's I'm clearly not having a go at children who want to be soldiers. I'm having a go at the structures and the narratives that tell them that they should want to be soldiers. And something I said in that interview was that there is a narrative in society, a militaristic narrative that and patriotic nationalist narrative that makes this kind of stuff the norm, makes it stuff that we're interested in and we think is good. And the author guy that they had on, just scoffed at it. He said, "Oh, there's not a narrative." And I'm like, what? There's not a narrative.
What do you believe your job is, sir?
Literally. And it's you have these interviews, and at the time, it's when the bully says something nasty to you at school, and then you go home that day, and at the end of the day, you're like, oh yeah, I should have said this, damn it, and it was exactly like that. Because watching it back now, I'm I had no response at the time because I didn't expect such inane questions. But now I'm okay, well, next time that comes up, then I have to respond like this because, that's the only way you can respond or whatever. So, yeah, I went on there. It was an odd interview. It was fine. They paid me some money to do it, which was helpful at the time because I was a student and really needed some money. So, yeah.
Speaking of someone who's done some far less glamorous jobs to make ends meet while they were at university, I think that sounds pretty good.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Yeah. So yeah, it was interesting. I didn't see any evidence of a toxic environment whilst I was there, but I was there.
Are you a This Morning truther? Is that?
Look, I have no idea. What's going on there. But what I think is very interesting with this whole stuff with Holly and Philip and so on is the moral indignation that a lot of people and a lot of media outlets and people involved have gone with. You know, Philip Schofield has lied about having an affair and, you know, with this younger guy. And I don't need Philip Schofield to be the most moral man in the world for morning TV, you know? Like, that's just not what I go to Philip Schofield for. So I find that element of it really interesting. I think there is a question about I don't know what it was, but the age gap, presumably they were all consenting adults, so fine, but there's always going to be a weird power dynamic in that kind of thing, so I think there are probably
and it's
some
particularly the
there.
case because Schofield met him prior
when he was young.
when he was a younger teenager, and I think Schofield got him the job on This Morning or something, was mentoring him or something like that. So there's a lot of questions about power dynamics.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of concern there, but at the same time, I think you have to recognise that whilst you don't want to defend, you know, what Schofield may or may not have done, it's also playing very strongly into a narrative around gay people that is worrying, and, you know, you do suspect that if this was a man and a younger woman, that it might not have been quite as publicised or sensationalised as it has been.
There's
but which is not to defend him, but to recognise the way that media narratives shape things, right? Like,
but I think also there's an element of this in. So you're absolutely right on the whole gay man, like the tropes that are around that. There also some of the headlines around that are sort of sensationalising this, I think, because his brother was recently convicted of making indecent images, like of paedophilia, right? There's no evidence that Schofield has done anything illegal.
Yeah.
I think, as I say, there are questions around power, around, yes, the age gap, but there's no suggestion that he's done anything illegal. I'm always fascinated around the moralising around the lives of celebrities. Because on some level, some celebrities are going to be role models for people, especially young people, and that's sort of unavoidable. That's the role they're in. But Philip Schofield, a morning TV presenter, I'm not sure about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. There's maybe an interesting conflation here, isn't there, where people are saying, oh, the people in charge, you know, are like this, they're hypocrites, they're duplicitous, they're nasty people. And, like, I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily not true. And certainly, this morning...
You know, he was on my side when I was on there. That's all I'm going to say. Right? Like, so I'm...
Yeah, and, like, I, you know, certainly This Morning is part of the way in which capitalism pushes certain narratives.
Yeah.
You know, that concept of the ideological state apparatus. I know it's a little bit controversial, but the idea that ideology is pushed out through various forms would definitely include something like This Morning. But at the same time, you know, the presenters of these shows are tools, not the people actually...
Wow.
Tools of the system, Adam.
So rude. Yeah, and to be honest, even the way they set up the segment that I was in, right? We had 7 minutes to talk about something that is a very complicated set of issues. We had 7 minutes to talk about it. with 2 guests and 2 presenters. Do you think we
Yeah.
were able to really bring a nuanced, balanced discussion to this? Were we, heck? And so on some level, even that was just there to push an ideological narrative.
Yeah, you're a tool too, Adam. That's what we're
I am,
concluding.
Yeah. The thing is, I admit to being a tool.
Our main topic today is going to be talking a little bit about evangelism and Church of England and other religions and all this malarkey, prompted by one of those lovely Anglican storm in a teacups I mentioned earlier, which was a tweet from the Church of England advertising a webinar. We need to start by recognising what a horrible word webinar is.
Oh, it's gross.
There's no need to use the term webinar in any context. That's not really the point, but I think it's important to, state our positions on these things early. The tweet said, "How can we best present the gospel to those of other faiths? Join the discussion with our latest webinar, Evangelism amongst other UK faith communities, how to be good news and bring good news." And this caused a little bit of consternation. Basically, quite a few people went, "Why would I want to do that?" And then other people went, "Why would you not want to do that?" And I felt like that second response was particularly revealing of, if we broadly label the first response liberal and the second conservative, we might get into why that's slightly more complicated. But, the fact that the Conservatives couldn't even conceptualise the liberal objection to that probably speaks volumes about the intellectual exchange between the camps within the Church of England, I think. Because the Liberals, they knew why what the Evangelicals and Conservatives wanted here. But yeah, it was a bit of a storm in a teacup. Adam said to me, "Oh, have you watched the webinar just to know what it's about?" And I said, "Absolutely not."
We do not need to be informed on this podcast.
Yeah.
What is this? I mean, I like to take cues from the Shitty Christians podcast and say you're an anti-reading podcast, but I don't think I could quite stretch that far.
We're an anti-webinar podcast for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The reason actually I said I'm not bothered with a webinar is partly because it's like an hour or 2 hours long and who has the time, but also because I'm more interested in the conversation that this tweet kind of brought up than I am in the actual webinar talking through it. I do think it's, I'm sure I've said this before on the podcast, but something I think is really notable about the Church of England at the minute is I think the evangelicals have won already, to be blunt. I think that the whole debate over same-sex marriage, people think that is about, whether the evangelicals get their way. And to some extent, there is at least a majority of evangelicals who are looking to oppose same-sex marriage. But I think actually the ideas of evangelicalism are so embedded in the Church of England. I would put money down that this tweet was not actually done, this webinar was not designed by hardcore conservative evangelicals. Actually, there aren't that many hardline conservative evangelicals working in the National Church of England at this point in time. It might well have been done by some nice middle-of-the-road liberals who don't realise that the ideas and the foundational concepts of evangelicalism have just so seeped into every aspect of the Church of England that they just assume that we want to convert people of other faiths because, of course, that's what you do, and are shocked to discover that there might be some people who are not on board with those sorts of ideas.
Well, and in fact, I did in fact watch a little bit of the webinar.
As we talked about before, you were much mentally stronger than me. You were able to deal with these things. I just can't do it. I can't cope.
Yeah. And actually, it is more nuanced than a lot of people are assuming. There's acknowledgement of the ethical implications of this kind of thing. So I think I appreciate that. I haven't watched the whole thing, so I wouldn't want to say too much more than that. But this stuff, they are aware of it, at least in the webinar. Sorry, the web seminar. And I think you're right. Like, there's a lot of this stuff is kind of put together and run by sort of more liberal Anglicans. But I think what they end up doing is you end up with this tweet where, regardless of what the actual content is, it's playing into a kind of way of thinking and a way of doing things that is going to get people's backs up on one side, and on the other side is going to just present it as basically conservative hardline evangelicalism, which isn't necessarily what it is, you know?
There was another tweet, and I promise we're going to stop talking about the Church of England's tweets in a moment, but there was another tweet that I also thought was, for this episode at least, it was a video from HTB Youth. HTB is one of the flagship evangelical churches in London. We could talk a lot about HTB. Justin Welby.
We have done at one point, haven't we? I'm sure we have.
Oh, sure we do regularly. Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, is from the HTB tradition, and they wield quite a lot of power in the Church of England, particularly in London. This is from their youth division, and anyway, the tweet says, starts with a quote. I've invited lots of friends. I'd really like them to encounter Jesus, and I think that youth night is a fun way and a good way for them to do that. By supporting young people to pray and invite friends, a church in London has seen numbers increase at their youth night. And it's so evangelical, so they have a youth night, they make all the kids put their phones in a safe so they can't use them, at which point I'd be like, I'm out, I'm not even a teenager, and you're not separating me from my phone for that long. And they say, well, we're going to pray for our friends, and there's a phrase in it which is that we've really seen a shift in our invitation culture. I was fascinated by this video because it really showed me how little in the last 15 years this culture has moved on, because you could have filmed that video in the young people orientated church space that I was in, as a teenager, and it would be identical. Apart from maybe locking the phones away because phones were slightly less of a big deal, although they were still present, not that old.
I can't believe, that's so weird.
What bit, the phones?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's about distraction, and it's playing into, evangelicals love to be get involved with what they think is a cool, well-being sort of trend stuff that they can maybe play to their advantage. And I think, people are talking about, want to do a phone detox, need to get kids off their phones and see the real world and stuff. So they've just jumped on that and then tagged on some evangelical stuff on top of it. And, called it Christianity.
I mean, it's just odd to me. I mean, I grew up, my teens in an evangelical church as well, but an open evangelical church. Uh-huh. So it's sort of a mix of things. And
And you had to queue to use the rotary telephone, right? In that.
Yeah. No, honestly, I think the strength of that church was that it had people of lots of different opinions and broadly evangelical traditions. And so there was a sort of quiet compromise on a lot of things. But the idea of taking teenagers' phones away at a youth club, I just can't imagine that ever happening there. And actually, a lot of that youth work, there are criticisms to make of it, fine. I think probably a lot of the ways we talked about evangelism as it happens, I would have criticisms of that now. But by far and away, they were the best youth provision in the town. So I don't know what that says.
Well, I mean, you can talk about cuts, and I could spend a long time talking about the horrible lack of youth provision as someone who used to be a youth worker and left mostly because the jobs weren't there anymore.
Yeah.
A real youth worker, not a church youth worker. Let's be very clear about that.
There are real youth workers who work in church youth work, to be fair, but a lot of them aren't.
Allegedly, yeah. I'm interested, Adam. Were you ever a little teenage evangelist? Did you have to invite your friends along to stuff, do all that sort of thing when you were younger?
We didn't have to. I think, there were times when our youth group was more evangelistic. There was certainly some of that, but I'm not sure it was quite as toxic as it can be.
Did you ever go out into the town and give out sweets and offer to pray for people?
I went out into the town dressed as Jesus with sweets, offering to pray for people. I shit you not. I mean, I was very young still. Either in my late teens, maybe my early 20s. So I had sort of the beginnings of a beard.
Because otherwise you often do dress like Jesus.
Yeah. The fattest Jesus you've ever seen, but Jesus nonetheless.
Yeah. Fattest and whitest to Jesus as well.
Yeah. Literally, I am so white.
I did the same thing. I was quite a successful little. I brought along a lot of my friends. Hello to any of those friends who are listening. Sorry, I owe you an apology. I feel bad about doing that to you, but I did bring a lot of them along to church youth stuff. None of them actually really converted or retained any. I don't think any of them that I brought along are regular church attenders. Not that that's, it's not like I'm a regular church attender, so that's not the judgment of anything, is it? But you know what I mean? Maybe there wasn't necessarily a long-term impact on that, but I did,
You never know, to be honest.
Yeah.
I
do know, but the long-term impact is probably quite negative. But
well, yeah, and maybe. I mean, I think the thing is, often we end up sort of having an opinion that is one way or the other on these things, and actually, it's probably a bit more nuanced than that. I have to say, for me, the youth provision at my church was brilliant. I genuinely think that played a role in me not topping myself when I was a teenager, because I had a really tough time at school, and actually I found the church and it was a relatively chill place. There was I wasn't compelled to believe one way or the other, and I think that was as I say, there are criticisms of it, but it was a healthier model than is often done. And so I think I don't have a problem with inviting people to church, to youth clubs or anything, depending on what that looks like.
Yeah.
And, what that's actually going to do for people. There are certainly churches I've been in before where I would not invite people to the church or to the youth club or anything like that. But I think we have to be able to look at them as individual cases, is what I'm saying here.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, we talked about this in the Hillsong episode a little bit, actually. For all the criticism we had of the Hillsong London church, you have to recognise that there are people who are struggling, who are lost, who are socially isolated, and churches like that, for all the ways in which they are awful, offer something to these people that they are missing elsewhere. And I think both as Christians and as leftists, there is a question about what we are doing to meet those needs in much more positive and healthy ways. But it's the same for these youth groups. These were safe havens for some young people that were desperately needed, whilst at the same time the things that were being taught and the things that were being encouraged to be done were often quite dangerous and wrong. Also, that they were a safe haven. So there's this really complicated legacy there, particularly as leftists. Actually, I do wonder what more we could be doing to meeting the needs of people who are currently snapped up by all sorts of things, whether that's evangelical, conservative forms of Christianity, whether that's things like pyramid schemes. There's lots of ways in which these people are grabbed hold of by movements and forces that are very negative. And actually, maybe as leftists, we need to be considering how we can offer these people belonging and safety and care in much more positive spaces.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's always really important to look at what's going on ideologically. Because, we can say, they're teaching the bad things, but it's not just that churches are teaching individually bad things. This teaching over here is bad, but the rest of it is good, right? No, often there's a fairly consistent ideological narrative happening. And I think we have to be attuned to that and able to identify it and work out whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and to help people to learn to find those things for themselves as well, especially young people. And yeah, so I think I'm very much in favour of churches having youth clubs and children's clubs and all that kind of thing. What I'm not in favour of is churches indoctrinating people into thinking their way and no other way, and teaching them often, fairly hateful ideologies.
So I break out in hives when I hear the word evangelism, right? But you've kind of mentioned not necessarily how everyone is inviting people along to stuff. So I'm interested in what is your... How do you see evangelism now?
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, because I think I've definitely gone through that thing of coming out of that world of evangelicalism and going from seeing evangelism as like the supremely important act of Christian witness to kind of being like, oh, this is really not comfortable. And I've sort of, for a while, sat with the idea that actually Jesus calls us to make disciples, not converts. And I think that's, I still believe that. I still believe that's important. And that's an important distinction to make. I think, for me, when we talk about what the gospel is, what the good news is, that's how I actually end up becoming more kind of okay with the term evangelism again. Because I don't conceive of evangelism primarily actually as you need to join this Christian club, and if you don't, you're going to hell. I see evangelism as, hey, this is what I'm involved with. Jesus said some really cool stuff, did some really cool stuff, and, some of that stuff fundamentally involves hospitality and community and building communities of love and solidarity, especially with the poor. And that is something that I can evangelize about. What I'm not saying is that I want to go out and make everyone a Christian, make everyone see that, the only way to not get crispy with Satan when you die is to say, yes, I am a Christian. I just don't think God's that concerned with us uttering the correct formula of words. And if we don't utter that formula of words, then, everything's lost, because people are more complicated than that, and cultures are more complicated than that, and people's brains are more complicated than that, right? I can't get on board with that anymore, but I can get on board with talking about Jesus and how cool he was and how we should all be communists.
Yeah, I think when Sarah, my wife's job, involved setting up a church, which has already, got people worried, church planting and all that, but, it's something we wrestled with because, well, there's this question of, if you're going to set up a new church, either you're stealing people from other churches, which you don't really want to do, or you're trying to bring in people anew. And there was this sense that we were trying to, or I should say she was trying to, along with the community, open a space for people who wanted or needed that space. Because there were people who had been brought up with Christianity and maybe wanted to explore it, but didn't have the spaces in which they could explore it, and in this case particularly, queer referring churches, there were none in the town. So, if you're a queer person who wanted to, explore their faith or explore what they might think about the Christian faith, there was no space to do that wasn't also going to tell you needed to leave your partner, right? But also people who, had complicated relationships or were interested in faith and wanted to explore that. And I think the key distinction, I guess, there is about it's finding people that were looking for something rather than trying to create that desire. A lot of evangelism focuses on taking whatever people are unsatisfied or feeling weird about or anything like that and kind of ginning it up to be actually what you really need is God. God's going to solve all those problems, and kind of creating that desire for some sort of faith exploration out of nothing. Whereas what we were saying was actually there are probably people out there who do want to explore their faith or are interested in things, whether they call themselves a Christian, former Christian, exploring whatever, want a space in which they can explore what that might mean and look like for them. And if you want to put a Christian spin on that, we were looking for people who there was already some work of the Holy Spirit in, I guess. Mm-hmm. And, there's complications there. And even that, I'm still... I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that even now. Yeah. And I don't know if I'd ever call that evangelism necessarily, but that felt like maybe of a more, and it relates to what I was saying about people that have needs, they're looking for stuff, and actually I'd rather they were in a church that was queer affirming and, wants to live in solidarity with oppressed peoples than in other churches or other spaces that would not be as positive, I guess. The other issue brought up by that Church of England tweet that we've talked about is, of course, the relationship to other faiths. And what we've mostly been talking about, how you relate to people who are culturally Christian or completely non-religious. But obviously, as well, there are people of different faiths knocking about. That tweet certainly suggested that there might be some value in converting those people into Christians. Adam, what is your approach to people of other faiths? Are you trying to convert everyone you meet who isn't a Christian into a Christian immediately?
No, incredibly.
Well, why on earth not?
Because I'm bad. I'm a bad Christian. Maybe I'm not even a proper Christian. No, I'm not. I mean, can you imagine the kind of artificial nature of friendships and relationships if everyone you ever met, all you could see in them was, well, this person is a potential disciple of Christ, no, I just want to be your friend, or maybe I don't want to be your friend. Maybe you're not for me, but that's not the primary thing I'm thinking about. everyone knows my faith. Everyone knows that I'm a Christian. Like, I'm pretty open about that, right? I'm training for ministry, for one thing, so that comes up pretty quickly in conversation. So that's not a problem for me. But ultimately, most of the time, I just want to be people's friends, and maybe we have some good conversations, and that's great. But no, my approach is much more to do with how people connect spiritually with God or whatever they call God, and with the earth and with the people around them and the people around the world. And if that means that you're doing that as a Muslim and that you're living your faith out in a way that loves people and is mindful of difference and of the things that really matter in the world, great. If that means you're living that out as a Christian, great. If that means you're living it out as a Buddhist, great. I'm not there to say you need to convert to Christianity. That's the only way.
Yeah, I think I'd be on board with that. No, I think that. I know that. I am on board with it.
Thank
I don't know why
goodness,
Ben.
Thank goodness.
There is a bit of a theological question that gets asked about how we deal with this. And, the classic thing is we talk about exclusivism, i.e. Jesus, Christianity is the only way to any form of salvation. Inclusivism, Jesus is still the only way, but he appears in many forms, including in other religions. And universalism, everyone is saved by Jesus regardless of what they believe. I have to say, I find all three of those quite unfulfilling in terms of their conception of salvation and that sort of thing. But I'm interested to know what you think. Would you identify with one of those? Are you kind of still someone who would say the most important thing is that Jesus saves you, even if he's saving you through other religions? Or are you just a full bore universalist? I'm not even going to suggest that you're an exclusivist. I know you're not. So
yeah, no, I'm not. I think first of all, I'd want to be very careful about assuming a kind of Christian supremacist kind of approach to this. There is wisdom and truth in other religions. There's wisdom and truth in atheist traditions as well. And the Bible isn't necessarily entirely consistent on this kind of thing. So I think we need to have an element of nuance about this as well. Ultimately, I believe in a form of universalism. I'm a Christian because I believe in the claims of Christianity, right? But as I've already said, I don't think that necessarily means that there isn't truth and wisdom in other religions as well. I'm not sure I've entirely fleshed out kind of exactly where I am on this stuff. Like, I think we often need to rethink how we think about salvation and atonement and that kind of thing, because that's what really ends up playing into this stuff. And so what I would say is I think anything that places the majority of the emphasis on Jesus dying and being resurrected, and therefore we can be, God doesn't want to send us to hell now, I think I reject that fairly squarely. I don't think that's primarily what was going on there on the cross. And I don't think that's primarily what was going on with Jesus. And the thing that I think is very important is to recognize that way of thinking removes all importance from the words and the actions of Jesus that happened up to that point.
Yeah.
And I think actually when we recontextualize it and when we start to see Jesus, his ministry, as equally important, well, what does he emphasize? He emphasizes community. He emphasizes eating together. He emphasizes solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. He doesn't emphasize, this idea of eternal conscious torment for those who don't believe the right thing. He doesn't say it's easy. He doesn't say any of this is easy.
Yeah.
But I also don't think that he sort of says that the most important thing is that you think that I am God incarnate and came to die for you and then rise from the dead again. I don't know. I've probably waffled on a bit there. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Well, yeah, I think there's something as well about, you are waffling, but I think it's important to be a bit waffly about this stuff in terms of that there's an idea within liberation theologies of, there are people being crucified, being put up on crosses all over the world right now. And the point is to take them off the cross.
Yeah.
And it feels like some of those questions about what do other religions mean, inclusivism or universalism, how do we relate? that feels a bit like standing around and reflecting on what Jesus is doing up there on the cross, rather than making an effort to take him down.
Yeah.
Which is actually the primary thing. You, a few years ago now, must have been, you went on a interfaith retreat, did you not?
Yeah.
With young Christians and Muslims. Only in a religious setting do we get to still count as young, but it's one of the great things about being Christian.
Hey, it was 4 years ago, all right? It was 4 years ago. I was... what was I? Was I quite 30 yet? I don't know. But that's still young, damn it.
Still young. Still young. Yeah, so you wrote about it in the Church Times as well, so we'll link that piece in the show notes. But yeah, do you want to share with us some of that experience of that interfaith work?
Yeah, no, it was an interesting weekend. The piece that I wrote, what I did is I did some interviews with Muslims and with Christians, and just asked them about why they were there, interfaith dialogue, about that kind of thing, and some really fascinating people came out of it. One person who I interviewed, who ended up not being in the article, unfortunately, was a woman she was a British woman who had been raised, I think, sort of nominally Christian. She'd converted to Islam, but she was an advocate against anti-Semitism. And I think for me, some of the way that played out for her, I think I would have issues with some of the way she framed that stuff, especially over the last few years with the way anti-Semitism has been sort of used as a tool to beat the left with. But what I did find interesting about that was that she was she was a Muslim. She had decided, she'd chosen that path, but she was also trying to combat anti-Semitism, especially within the Muslim community. And I thought, there's something very important about that. There are other people, some people who did a pilgrimage together. One was a Muslim, one was a Christian. And the thing that really came out of this was that none of these people were trying to change each other's minds. None of them were actually saying, you need to believe my faith. What they were doing is they were making friends and thinking about faith together and learning together and realizing that it's okay to take wisdom from and to learn from people of other faiths. And I think that was really important for me. And I think at that time I was also spending some time in Buddhist communities as well, because my partner at the time was a Buddhist. So I went to sort of Buddhist retreat centers and to Buddhist temples and Buddhist groups and so on. And I think that for me was really valuable as well, because again, there's a lot of beauty and a lot of wisdom in the Buddhist faith. Now, I'm not a Buddhist. There are things I disagree with. And I think something that's really important to recognize if you're going to have an honest, fruitful dialogue, is to recognize those points of disagreement. And I think that's okay and that's good. You don't have to be a dick about it.
You were.
Yeah. No, but that's the thing. If I'm going to pay the respect to someone and their faith when they have a different faith to me, actually a part of that respect is by recognizing where I disagree with it and disagree with them.
Yeah.
And I would hope that they would do the same with me. But that disagreement doesn't have to end in, well, you have to agree with me and therefore convert to my faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a productive disagreement there that is about dialogue rather than about winning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, that's the thing about evangelism, is it's a zero-sum game, right?
Yeah.
Either you convert them or you don't. And there's theories of evangelism that say, well, actually there's like 20 steps and you maybe step 4 along the path, but ultimately you're still trying to, you're just making it more of a team effort. It's a team sport, but you're still trying to win the team sport. Whereas what you're talking about, interfaith dialogue and interfaith work, is much more about having those conversations, learning, sharing, being in community, rather than, two people trying to kind of win the other person over.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you talked about learning from other traditions, and you mentioned atheist traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's probably worth mentioning that, as socialists, as leftists, whatever you believe the role in leftism and Christianity might play, or religion more generally might play, I think to me it's pretty inarguable that has historically been an atheist tradition.
Well, in the modern era, yes. If we're talking about Marxism and then sort of what has become anarchism, I think that's true. But actually, prior to that, socialist and communist traditions were very much grounded in people's faith as well.
Sure, and I'm not trying to dismiss that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, recognising that inherently as Christians who are also Marxist or anarchists, it's kind of built in that we have to learn from other faith traditions because they are not just atheist, but in places anti-religious traditions that we are trying to find our place in as religious people. Yeah. So, I guess it is, it's not just about other religions, but it's about recognising that there are traditions that we might not just learn from, that we want to put ourselves in, and we have to recognise that while we bring a religious perspective to those, they are atheist traditions in some ways, and that's always an interesting thing to navigate.
Yeah, it is. And I think something, and I've probably said this on the pod before, but something that I think is interesting about the way we are navigating that compared to the way people similar to us would have been navigating that in years gone by, even talking sort of 15, 20 years ago, is that people, especially young people, young left-wing people, are a lot more open to religion now. Not necessarily that they want to practice it themselves, although there is I think an interest, a growing interest in particularly sort of esoteric, what you might call esoteric kind of religions or faith practices and spiritualities, but actually a growing understanding of culture and the fact that people's politics cannot be separated from their faith and from the culture that they've come from as well. And I think one of the things I said in the article was I was talking to a young woman called Semra, who was a Muslim who grew up in Bavaria in Germany. And she made the important point that her decision to wear a headscarf intersected with her identity as a BAME woman. And that, wearing that sort of marked her out as belonging to a religion, but also belonging to a religion as a minority. As she said, I don't know what it is to be invisible. That was eye-opening for me, and I think that sort of speaks to this idea of learning from people of other faiths. As her friend said, Muslims have questions about God that Christians often aren't asking, and I'm sure that's the other way around as well. There was a time when a lot of that was a lot more recognised, the influence of Islam on the West, actually. I mean, even things like our numerical system, we use Arabic numerals now. We don't use Roman numerals. We use Arabic numerals. And, that's something that we sort of take for granted. But I think it's something that, it matters to recognise the ways in which our own culture is influenced for the better by cultures and religions of other people.
We're going to move on now to Saint of the Week. Cue the theme.
Saint of the Week.
What a beautiful theme. We are going to talk about William Seymour, who you may or may not have heard of, but he was the preacher in charge of the Azusa Street Revival. The Azusa Street Revival essentially creates 20th century Pentecostal movement, which I imagine you have heard of. If you're thinking about people speaking in tongues, falling to the floor, having all sorts of weird stuff going on, you're thinking about Pentecostalism. You're potentially also thinking, how is the guy who started that going to be Saint of the Week? And that's a fair question. William Seymour was a black preacher in Los Angeles, and in about, 1906, he was doing some worship services at a place called Azusa Street. And what happened there was essentially the first manifestation of what we come to see as kind of modern Pentecostalism. So people are experiencing what they believe to be the Holy Spirit in some interesting and powerful and visible ways. You can have your opinions about the legitimacy of that, how much that is psychological, how much that is actual experiences, what the distinction between those two things are. Anyway, those are all quite complicated questions, and I don't know enough about William Seymour to tell you if he was any sort of comrade or what his views on social issues were. The reason that I've picked him for State of the Week, and I think it's interesting in the fact that we've just celebrated Pentecost, is that, as I mentioned, this was a black preacher and a black church, but as well as attracting a lot of dismissal from both local media and other Christians, they also get a lot of Christians coming to join them because they recognise that something exciting is happening here. And there is a man, a kind of famous preacher and theologian called Charles Parham, and he comes to speak for a series of meetings there, and then almost immediately gets uninvited because he is horrified at the racial mixing that is happening here.
No, I'm sorry, Ben. We can't have no platforming. It's funny how long no platforming has been a thing, and yet now it's like all of a sudden the right and liberals are like, well, you can't no platform people. We've been no platforming racists and bigots for a long time.
Yeah. He actually kind of no platforms himself in that he basically storms out when he realises people aren't going to accept what he's saying, sets up his own new Pentecostal movement, which, again, that is the history of Pentecostalism, right? Splitting into new churches.
Don't some of the really big white Pentecostal churches of today, like maybe Assemblies of God, I don't know, don't quote me on that, but like that kind of thing, don't they can trace their lineage back to this guy?
Yeah. So arguably in the end, his church becomes more influential because it was the racially divided church, which, we wouldn't expect white people to appropriate the culture of a predominantly black movement. But anyway, so Parham, basically, I'm going to quote here from the Wikipedia about it. Parham was aghast that black people were not in their place, quote unquote, and simply could not abide, quote, white people imitating unintelligent, crude Negroisms of the Southland and laying it on the Holy Spirit. He also says that God is sick at his stomach, which is interesting because, God, not a human being. Don't know if you've heard about this. It's quite important.
Wait, what?
Says that God would not stand for such, quote, animalism. So this guy, super racist, if you're not picking that up.
Wow.
But what's interesting about this is that although Parham storms out, for most of the time that Azusa Street revival is happening, it is run by William Seymour and a bunch of black elders. And this is a point in time in which, while Parham's stuff is shocking today, most people would agree church is not a place for black and white people to mix together. I mean, American churches are still fairly racially divided, but back then there was a really strict colour line between the black churches and white churches. And yet what you have here is not just a white church that allowed black people to attend, which would have been controversial in and of itself, but a black church led by black people in which white people came along and submitted to the authority of the black leadership, which is amazing. That is something that simply did not happen, was really shocking to people to see.
And it's also important to say as well that because of the nature of Pentecostalism as a movement, anyone could basically say, it's a very horizontally arranged movement, and anyone could say anything, basically, no matter what gender. That's the other important thing, is that Pentecostalism is one of the earliest denominations to have women as leaders. So it didn't matter what gender or colour, race or whatever you were, you could basically say stuff and preach and so on.
Yeah, and I think that whatever you think about Pentecostalism, I'm certainly not a Pentecostal, but the Charles Parham Pentecostalism seems to win, right? Overall, it unfortunately, that is the history, and conservative Pentecostalism is the norm, and even majority black forms of Pentecostalism are extremely conservative now. Yeah. But it's perhaps interesting to think about what a form of Pentecostalism, as initiated by William Seymour, might have looked like. One in which there is not just racial equality and intermingling, but that black people are allowed to be in charge and white people will submit to their authority. Even now, that's actually not something you see very much at all. But back then, it was completely unheard of. Yeah, what a Pentecostal tradition might have looked like that started from that point, rather than ended in some less pleasant places. And that is why William Seymour is our slightly complicated Saint of the Week.
Have we? I don't think we've had an uncomplicated Saint of the Week yet, have we? And I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, as we talked about last time, right? Like Saint of the Week, we present them as people who are interesting and have done some worthwhile stuff, but are definitely imperfect human beings. So if William Seymour did a bunch of bad stuff, which I would not be surprised, then yeah, that's bad. But I still think the inspiration of that interracial church is worth reflecting on.
You know, I could be wrong, but I don't see a lot of evidence that he did anything bad. I mean, like he wasn't especially.
No, me neither.
It seems like he wasn't especially political, but what he was willing to challenge racism and hierarchical structures and models of power, and like there's an implicit politicism in that I think we can draw from and celebrate.
Yeah, and I think Pentecostalism has a place in the Bible, but its primary thing is the following the Spirit, right? Like, that's its big deal.
Yeah.
And I think there are very negative versions of that, but it's not hard to imagine a positive version of that. As you mentioned, Pentecostals were some of the first to accept women leadership.
Including, actually, Seymour, including William Seymour. He rejected the idea that women couldn't play a part in this as well, you know, on an equal footing.
Yeah. And it's not hard to imagine that, you know, if you take that as your starting point, then extending that to queer inclusion, right? Actually, if the Spirit is moving in queer people, and I think, you know, most of us would accept that it is. Certainly anyone listening to this podcast probably agrees with that.
Yeah, if you don't believe in that,
you know,
you should probably turn off. Please don't tell anyone.
To be clear, unless you don't believe in the Holy Spirit, that's fine. We're cool with that.
But to be clear,
yeah. Yeah, we do. We're Orthodox Christians, but our atheist listeners, you're cool. Don't think that was a dig at you. Our homophobe listeners, if there are any of you, piss off.
Or change your mind. You know, that would be preferable.
Yeah, piss off and change your mind.
Well, change your mind and come back.
And then come back.
and tell your mates.
Yeah. I think that will just about do us for the week. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining me. You can find us at all your usual podcast feedy places, and if you would like to review us, we would be very grateful for that. You can find us at facebook.com/breadandrosaries, Twitter at bread_rosaries, and you can email us breadandrosaries@gmail.com. We love to hear from people. If you have suggestions, ideas, critiques, thoughts, whatever, we're always interested in hearing from people. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places at CommieXIAN.
Brilliant. We have a Patreon if you'd like to throw some pennies towards the costs of running a podcast. There are all sorts of fun things on there. The link will be in the description. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Thank you for joining me, Adam.
Thanks very much.
See you later, everyone. Bye.
We'll go on. We'll go on. We'll go on. Well, it came to me while I was working sideways, rolling silverware, thinking what's my time was. Before my thought could finish, my girl sent a text saying we should end it. Initially, didn't know what to feel. She said my plans to leave for California gave her questions. I took a deep breath, took down my shield. Said best of luck with St. Paul, see you in the next one. Press on, and that's one less bag to pack. Cause once the sign that hits the road, there's no looking back. Music is my mistress, Wiley is the magic hat. Los Angeles is my spacecraft to crash. Just a waiter in a restaurant dreaming, letting his mind wander while he's cleaning. Working with the means of a blind swordsmith. I won't need to see the light to know I'm closing in. Collide with the night till you lose it. Collide until you've lost it all. And when you're almost at the bottom, check your pulse if you still got it. Don't know of anything worth this latest from. Oh, we're going high, high, high in the heavens above. Working with fire, fire, fire from the hell below.
Invitation culture.
Okay. Oh, the dog's barking.
Do you need to deal with it or?
I don't think so. Probably someone's at the door or something. Doggo, shut up. Honestly, sort your life out, yeah? Right, up you get. Up you get. Keep your mouth shut, or you'll be banned from the podcast.
Luca did not like the phrase invitation culture.
Or maybe she did. Maybe she loved it. I don't actually speak dog, so yeah.
Yeah, maybe she's... Actually, Luca has been inviting all her doggy friends along to youth night at her local church.
Never without those who click share and their kickstart for Wiley and I to even sit here. The world's a hardened sinner spinning out of spite. It can beg the question of where to draw the finish line. So I close my eyes longer than I can afford it. I won't need to see it to know I'm moving toward it.